Hello everyone, Books with Banks back again with another video, and today I'm going to do a first for the channel. Today I'll be reviewing a non-fiction book. So for a little context, I'm doing a new series this year where once a month I'm talking about a pair of Shakespeare plays, plays that I haven't read, as I go through and try to read these remaining 12 or so that I'm kind of missing, and the ones that I know little to nothing about. I've already released episode 1 this month, in which I covered the plays Two Gentlemen of Verona and Titus Andronicus. But in my process of starting out that series, I also started looking around online and on YouTube for lectures and discussions with Shakespeare scholars. I kept stumbling upon videos in which Dr. Emma Smith, a professor of Shakespeare studies at Oxford, videos in which she would be talking about many of my favorite aspects when it comes to reading Shakespeare. And it turns out Smith has a book called This is Shakespeare, published in 2019. I believe 2019 is the earliest version. So I decided to pick this up and give it a read, and now here's my review. But first, real quick, if you're into Shakespeare and the series I'm doing, the double feature series I'm doing, has you interested in my channel, it would mean a lot if you could please like and subscribe, share, comment, all that jazz. But here we go. So, This is Shakespeare by Emma Smith. In large part, I feel that this is a book dedicated to making Shakespeare feel less intimidating. Smith argues throughout that there is no one right way to read or to interpret any of Shakespeare's works. I feel that this could be a helpful angle for anyone new to any of these plays, especially anyone in school who might have just been assigned something like Romeo and Juliet or Julius Caesar, and now maybe you're worried you're not going to understand it properly. The whole point of this book is that if you engage with the text at least, and you make an effort to understand the story, there's really no such thing as a misreading, or unless you're totally ignoring what's written on the page. In Smith's terms, Smith explains how Shakespeare's texts are full of these question marks and these gaps. And again, in her terms, this gappiness of Shakespeare's works can make them all the more approachable. Instead of leading to a bunch of head scratching and those fears of misinterpreting something that Shakespeare never actually spelled out for us, these gaps should be actually seen more as invitations and windows of opportunity for readers and audiences, directors, performers to actually have fun and kind of play around with their own interpretations of any of these plays. Now, as with any good study in the humanities, it all kind of centers around what's the conversation right now? What's the big debate with such and such a text? What's the big shift in trends surrounding how we talk about these works? Well, this book is all about those debates, and the debates and conversations being had over these more mysterious gaps in Shakespeare's works. And I feel that Smith structured her book in a very approachable way, organizing each chapter around one play, and specifically one theme or gap in each of those plays. She covers 20 plays and 20 chapters, so just over half of the Bard's works. I would say this is a sufficient amount to cover a variety of Shakespeare's strengths and to also display the variety of plays he's worked on in his lifetime. But this also then leaves 18 or so plays for us readers and fans to then go think about after this book and think, how might Smith have analyzed such and such a gap in any of those other plays, in Titus Andronicus or Two Gentlemen of Verona, for instance. But with the 20 that she does focus on, she arranges them in a rough chronology, starting with The Taming of the Shrew, one of the Bard's earliest plays, and ending with The Tempest, often thought to be one of his latest. Smith could have organized the plays by genre, though I'm actually glad she didn't. Otherwise, I would have rushed right to the section about the histories, which are my favorites, and I would have paid less attention to all the rest. Also, it seems that Smith has done extensive work outside of this book. Well, obviously, in her profession as a Shakespeare scholar, but specifically she's done work on and like research into the publication of the first folio, which was this original collection of most of Shakespeare's plays published posthumously in 1623, and with slight deviations from earlier like quarto publications of some of the plays that were included there. In that folio collection, that was the first time the plays were categorized by the genres that they're kind of famously categorized in now, the comedies, histories, tragedies. And some of the plays don't easily or comfortably fit within their original categorizations. And it, just from watching lectures and listening to discussions of Smith's online and reading this book, it's clear that she wanted to avoid misrepresenting any of these plays by using a similar kind of a genre breakdown. So yes, ultimately, I'm glad Smith organized her book in this rough chronological order instead. Now let's get into her analysis and the questions that she raises, conversations she contributes to, or in some cases possibly begins, pertaining to a few of these plays. I'm not going to go through all 20 of what she covers and her kind of like the points that she picks out, but I'll go through 3 of them, I think. So first, what does she have to say about The Taming of the Shrew? Well, this is obviously a problematic and pretty sexist play, but it doesn't exactly have to be. Smith takes a closer look at Kate, or really Catherine's, speech at the end of the play, in which a surface level reading might suggest Kate has finally been won over by Petruchio and she is happy to serve him as his wife. But one of the things Smith does to examine our assumptions, or to re-examine our assumptions about this play, is she brilliantly calls our attention to the lack of stage directions. Sure, Petruchio says, "Go on and kiss me, Kate," but does she? Most performances say she does. They have some kind of stage direction written in there. But she doesn't have to. The original didn't have any stage direction. And if she refuses the kiss, then this totally changes the tone of everything in her preceding soliloquy. And what's so great about Smith's approach is that she's never arguing that the play should be performed one of those ways or the other. Her argument almost always boils down to how these gaps had things filled in for them in early productions and adaptations, and now those early edits and those early fill-ins, those are kind of often taken as granted, as like original to the text, when they absolutely shouldn't be. These plays are just as malleable nowadays as they were when the Shakespeare's acting company, the Lord Chamberlain's Men and King's Men, were first given their scripts and interpreting what Shakespeare intended. No matter how many times we've seen Kate kiss Petruchio, who cares? The fun of Shakespeare is that she doesn't have to. Next, I've mentioned my love for the histories in some of my other videos and in this one as well, but let's skip over the first history she talks about, that being Richard III, and let's jump to what she has to say about Richard II. Now, there are 4 Shakespeare plays that I'll pretty much always consider my favorites, at least for now, and Richard II is one of them. I think a big part of my love for this play in particular is that I went into the first time I read it, I went into it totally blind. I read the play, loved it, then I watched the Ben Whishaw Hollow Crown adaptation, and what I loved about that experience was picking out all the differences in how I read the play versus how it was being performed and adapted. Smith spends much of this chapter comparing and contrasting our leading man, our tragic hero Richard, with his cousin and eventual usurper, Henry Bolingbroke, eventually Henry IV. So much of this play and the conversation around this play is about who is the protagonist here, who's the antagonist, who's in the right, or who's in the wrong. Was it right for Henry to take the crown from his cousin? Was Richard II really that bad of a monarch? Smith calls attention to the context in this chapter. She calls attention to the context of other plays audiences were experiencing around Richard II. For example, back in the 1590s, audiences were probably familiar with plays chronicling the corrupt and tyrannical, irresponsible reign of Richard. Smith even highlights how there are historical events alluded to that were specifically, or there are historical events alluded to in Act 1 of Richard II that were specifically covered in another playwright's work that Shakespeare was likely relying on his audience to have some kind of working knowledge of, um, so that it kind of got rid of a lot of the work that he had to do in setting up the dramatic conflict, or a dramatic conflict at the beginning of this play, a conflict that kind of snowballs into the series of events that ultimately leads to Richard banishing Henry early on, right? So there was that context back then, but context of other plays we might experience Richard in nowadays, we understand the protagonist-antagonist dynamic in this play could be very much influenced by the fact that we know this play exists in a series of history plays in which the usurper becomes the titular character, not the main, but the titular one of the next two plays, those being Henry IV Part 1, Henry IV Part 2. Even further, looking outside of just the Henry IVs and this play, beyond that, we have the context of the Henry VI plays and the eventual downfall of the Lancaster dynasty, all started by what Henry Bolingbroke started back here in Richard II. So, should Richard II be performed as a sequel of sorts to other plays written and performed by Shakespeare's contemporary playwrights and performers? Should it be performed as the first part of Henry IV's story, the first part of Henry V's story in the Henriade collection of 4 history plays? Or should it be performed as the first part of the much larger sequence of 8 connected history plays that would suggest all of the bloodshed in France and then the Civil War and War of the Roses all might have happened because Henry Bolingbroke went against God's will, went against a Plantagenet monarch, and went against a Plantagenet monarch when he deposed Richard. Not to mention, another kind of wrinkle in all of this, not only were audiences back then familiar with other plays that had to do with Richard II and his advisors and predecessors, audiences were also very familiar with those chronologically later Henry VI plays and Richard III, all of which Shakespeare and his acting company, or all of which Shakespeare wrote and the company performed before Richard II. So if audiences had a good knowledge of history, they knew that the Lancaster Plantagenet conflict really started here with Richard II. Basically, the gaps and variety of performance interpretations with this play largely boil down to how we're portraying Richard and how we're portraying Henry. And those portrayals have a lot to do with what series or context of other related plays are we placing Richard II within. And yes, I think Smith really just helped me understand a little bit more about what I enjoy so much about this play. But moving on, one final play, one more example. Let's talk about what Smith has to say about King Lear. King Lear, another of those main kind of like top 4 plays that I just absolutely love. Smith does something unique with Lear compared to what she does with the other ones, or with her other chapters. And what she examines with King Lear really appealed to me as my studies were in history. Smith walks us through the production history of this particularly tragic tragedy and how different settings and attitudes approach the problem of putting on a production of Lear and the question of how sad is too sad. Lear is a play that has had drastically different versions and altered passages, removed passages, like things thrown and added into it, and even evidence that Shakespeare himself had various versions of this one. I think the same can be said about Hamlet, and heck, probably a lot of Shakespeare's plays, because what authors do we know today who are, ever perfectly happy with the first draft or even the first published draft of something? Anyway, Smith used this chapter to look at how Lear hasn't really suffered from that fear of ruining the master bard's original perfect work. There's no like purists saying, oh, well, we have to perform it exactly how it was written with Lear, because it doesn't seem like people in the late 17th century especially really thought there was anything perfect or masterful about King Lear, or at least nothing perfect about the ending. It seems many felt the play was far too nihilistic and meaningless in how horrible Shakespeare treated the central characters. But that was then, and this is now. Smith acknowledges that since the beginning of the 20th century, there have been more and more productions and adaptations fully embracing the absolute depths of darkness that many of the earlier versions of this play go to, as opposed to productions that rejected those dark elements in centuries past. I felt that Smith used this chapter to explore one of the ways in which these gaps affect productions, and she used Lear to demonstrate how different modes of thinking and different cultures are going to be able to fill in the gaps in their own wonderful ways with their own contemporary subjectivities. And furthermore, that this isn't supposed to be frustrating or confusing for the Shakespeare fan or scholar, but rather exciting. It's not, oh, wait, there's a few different versions. Do we have to read each one? What's going on here? I'm so confused. It's, wait, yay, there's another version that might illuminate this character I've been struggling to understand or nail down in a performance, or this might illuminate this plot element that I was grappling with. Yes, please, I'll take all the different versions of Lear that I can take. That's what's so exciting about it. So, those are just 3 examples and kind of brief explanations of what I felt Smith did so well with this book. I should also add that Smith covered a handful of plays like Twelfth Night, Merchant of Venice, Measure for Measure, Coriolanus, and Antony and Cleopatra, none of which I've read yet, but now when I go into them for the first time, I'll have at least one angle to approach each of these, one kind of more analytical angle, so I'll be really grateful to this book when I get to those plays. I'll be paying attention more to, say, the Antonio character in Twelfth Night, or I'll pay more attention to the idea of kind of the tragic celebrity in Antony and Cleopatra, all thanks to This is Shakespeare by Emma Smith. So, kind of in conclusion, wrapping up, I would recommend anyone with even a small interest in Shakespeare read this book. And if you're not super into the whole thing, at least maybe check out the chapters on the plays that you're more familiar with or that you're more interested in. I also highly recommend this to anyone who really wants to get into Shakespeare, but who's always felt kind of intimidated by it or felt there's kind of a barrier between academia and just the public enjoyment of these plays. All in all, if it's not clear, I love this book, and it only has me more excited than ever to continue on with my Shakespeare Double Features series. So thank you all so much for watching. Have a great day. Bye.